The year was 430 BCE, and beneath the gleaming marble columns of the Parthenon, a darkness lurked that would make even the most depraved modern minds recoil in horror. While schoolchildren today learn about ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, the cradle of Western civilization, they never hear about the sexual practices that defined daily life in Athens and Sparta. Practices so twisted, so systematically brutal, that they would be considered war crimes by today's standards. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the ancient Greeks. Behind their celebrated ideals of beauty, wisdom, and political innovation lay a culture of sexual exploitation so comprehensive and methodical that it puts the worst excesses of any modern society to shame. This wasn't the work of a few deviant individuals operating in shadows. These were institutionalized practices, celebrated in art, protected by law, and justified by the greatest philosophical minds in human history. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for over 2 millennia, painted on pottery that sits in the world's most prestigious museums, carved into monuments that tourists photograph every day, written in texts that scholars study in universities across the globe. But the full picture has been deliberately obscured, sanitized by historians who couldn't bear to confront the reality of what their beloved classical civilization actually was. Today, we're going to examine the archaeological evidence, the legal documents, and the literary sources that reveal a society where sexual dominance determined everything from political power to basic survival. Where children as young as 12 were systematically exploited by adults in their 30s and 40s. Where women existed as nothing more than breeding stock to be bought and sold. Where even the gods themselves provided mythological justification for acts that would horrify any civilized person. This investigation will take us through practices that were so normalized, so embedded in the fabric of Greek society, that questioning them was virtually impossible. We'll discover how the same culture that gave us Socrates and Plato created a hierarchy of sexual exploitation that reached into every corner of daily life, from the highest temples to the humblest households. The key to understanding Greek sexual culture lies in grasping one fundamental principle that governed their entire worldview. In ancient Greece, there was no concept of sexual orientation as we understand it today. No gay or straight, no homosexual or heterosexual. Instead, Greek society operated on a rigid hierarchy based entirely on one thing: who penetrated and who was penetrated during intimate encounters. Your role in these acts didn't just determine your bedroom activities, it determined your legal status, your political rights, your social standing, and ultimately whether you lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. Being the dominant partner meant masculinity, authority, and power. Being the submissive partner meant femininity, weakness, and social death for any adult male. This wasn't some abstract philosophical concept debated in academic circles. This sexual hierarchy was the invisible foundation that supported their entire civilization. It shaped their laws with brutal precision. It determined career opportunities and business partnerships. It decided who could speak in the agora and who had to remain silent. Most terrifyingly, it created a system where sexual exploitation became not just acceptable, but essential for maintaining social order. The most powerful men in Athens and Sparta weren't just wealthy or politically connected. They were sexually dominant, and everyone knew it. Their authority flowed directly from their ability to impose their will on others through sexual conquest. Meanwhile, those who found themselves in submissive positions discovered that their political opinions, business ventures, and even their basic human dignity became worthless overnight. Archaeological evidence from across the Greek world reveals how deeply this hierarchy penetrated daily life. Contracts for business deals included clauses about the sexual status of partners. Legal documents specified different punishments based on whether crimes were committed by dominant or submissive individuals. Even religious ceremonies incorporated rituals that reinforced these sexual power dynamics, making resistance not just socially dangerous, but spiritually blasphemous. The normalization was so complete that Greek children grew up understanding their future social status would be determined by their sexual roles as adults. Boys learned from their earliest years that their path to citizenship and respect required sexual dominance over others. Girls discovered that their entire existence would revolve around serving the sexual needs of whatever man gained ownership of them. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. The Greeks didn't just accept this sexual hierarchy as a necessary evil or unfortunate reality. They celebrated it as the highest form of human organization, a divine arrangement that separated civilized people from barbarians. Their greatest philosophers wrote elaborate justifications for why sexual exploitation was not only acceptable, but essential for human flourishing. This brings us to the most shocking aspect of Greek sexual culture, one that reveals the true depths of their systematic abuse. What modern society would immediately recognize as child sexual abuse, the Greeks celebrated as the cornerstone of elite education. The practice they called pederasty wasn't hidden in dark corners or whispered about in shame. It was the foundation of their most prestigious educational institutions, praised in their finest literature and protected by their most sacred laws. Adult men in their 30s and 40s didn't just pursue sexual relationships with boys as young as 12. They competed for them in elaborate public displays, showering chosen children with expensive gifts and political connections. Families didn't protect their sons from these advances. They encouraged them, viewing these relationships as the only pathway to social advancement and political power. The systematic nature of this exploitation becomes clear when examining the specific rules that govern these relationships. The older man, known as the erastes, would select a younger boy, the eromenos, through a process that resembled a marketplace transaction. The boy's physical beauty, family connections, and potential for future success determined his value in this horrific economy of childhood exploitation. These weren't secret relationships conducted in hidden locations. They were public partnerships celebrated in art, literature, and religious festivals. Parents who refused to allow their sons to participate in these arrangements found their children excluded from the best schools, the most influential social circles, and the pathways to political power. The choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between exploitation and complete social extinction. The age parameters reveal the calculated cruelty of this system. Boys became available for these relationships at the onset of puberty, typically around 12 to 14 years old. The partnerships were expected to end when facial hair appeared, usually by 18 or 20. But the timing wasn't about protecting children from harm. It was about maintaining the power dynamic that made the exploitation possible in the first place. Once a boy developed masculine features, continuing the relationship would threaten the older man's dominant status within the sexual hierarchy. The system required fresh victims who were obviously powerless, obviously dependent, obviously incapable of challenging their abuser's authority. When boys grew too old to serve this function, they were discarded and replaced with younger children. The educational justification adds another layer of horror to these practices. The Greeks didn't present these relationships as purely sexual encounters. They marketed them as mentorship programs, where experienced men taught younger boys about politics, philosophy, and social graces. The sexual component wasn't considered an unfortunate side effect of these arrangements. It was viewed as essential to the educational process itself. Greek philosophers developed elaborate theories explaining why physical intimacy between men and boys created superior learning environments. They argued that emotional bonds formed through sexual relationships enhanced the transfer of knowledge and wisdom. The physical component wasn't treated as abuse or exploitation. it was presented as a revolutionary educational technique that separated Greek civilization from the primitive methods used by barbarian cultures. Archaeological discoveries across Greece reveal the industrial scale of this systematic abuse. Pottery fragments from prestigious households show detailed scenes of these relationships, not hidden away in private collections, but displayed prominently in public spaces. Temple carvings celebrate these partnerships as divine arrangements blessed by the gods themselves. Legal documents outline specific regulations governing these relationships, treating them with the same bureaucratic precision applied to business contracts or property transfers. The psychological manipulation involved in these arrangements was sophisticated and comprehensive. Boys entered these relationships believing they were receiving honor and privilege, special selection that marked them as exceptional among their peers. The older men presented themselves as generous benefactors offering opportunities that would otherwise remain forever beyond reach. This indoctrination was so thorough that many victims defended their abusers long into adulthood, viewing their childhood exploitation as the foundation of their success. The system created perfect conditions for psychological control, combining dependency with supposed privilege, fear with fabricated gratitude, victimization with imagined advancement. But the horror extended far beyond individual relationships into the very structure of Greek military culture. Sparta's legendary warrior training program transformed child abuse into patriotic duty. The agog began when boys reached 7 years old, removing them from their families to enter a system where older warriors became their trainers, mentors, and sexual partners. These arrangements weren't optional or informal. They were mandatory components of military preparation, considered essential for developing the fierce loyalty and unquestioning obedience that made Spartan armies legendary throughout the ancient world. Boys who resisted or showed reluctance faced brutal punishment and permanent exclusion from military service. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Older warriors chose their favorites based on physical beauty, athletic potential, and family connections. Boys who weren't selected experienced social ostracism and limited career prospects. Those who were chosen entered relationships they had no power to refuse, with men who controlled every aspect of their daily existence. The training regimen deliberately created vulnerability that facilitated abuse. Boys were intentionally underfed, inadequately clothed, and subjected to harsh physical discipline. In this weakened state, they depended entirely on their older partners for protection, additional food, and emotional support. The system manufactured the exact conditions that predators require to maintain control over their victims. Spartan society celebrated these relationships as the source of their military superiority. They believed that warriors who'd been sexually bonded with their trainers would fight more fiercely to protect their partners and avenge their deaths. The emotional trauma inflicted on children was reframed as character building that created unbreakable masculine bonds. Military historians have documented how these practices spread throughout the Greek world, adopted by other city-states seeking to replicate Spartan effectiveness. What began as localized abuse in one region became a systematic feature of military training across the Mediterranean, justified by battlefield results that seemed to validate the methods used to achieve them. While Greek men exploited boys through these supposedly educational relationships, women faced their own systematic degradation through marriage practices that reduced them to breeding stock and household property. Marriage in ancient Greece bore no resemblance to modern concepts of partnership or mutual consent. It functioned as a business transaction where fathers sold daughters to men who could afford them. The age disparities in these arrangements were staggering and deliberate. Men typically married in their 30s after establishing their careers and accumulating wealth. Girls were given away as early as 12 or 13, immediately after reaching physical maturity. These weren't partnerships between equals. They were legal transfers of ownership where adult men gained absolute authority over children. Wedding ceremonies celebrated these transactions with elaborate rituals that emphasized the bride's transition from her father's property to her husband's possession. The language used in marriage contracts explicitly described women as objects being transferred between male owners. There were no provisions for female consent, no mechanisms for escape, no recognition that women possessed any autonomous will worth considering. The wedding night often involved what modern law would classify as statutory rape, celebrated as the natural consummation of a legitimate marriage. Greek medical texts discuss treatments for injuries commonly sustained by young brides, written with clinical detachment that reveals how routine these traumatic experiences had become. Legal codes formalized women's inferior status with brutal precision. Married women couldn't own property, conduct business, or make legal decisions without their husband's explicit permission. They existed entirely under masculine authority, with no recourse if that authority was exercised through violence or cruelty. Domestic abuse wasn't considered a crime. It was viewed as a husband's right and responsibility for maintaining proper household order. The isolation imposed on respectable women reached levels that modern minds struggle to comprehend. In many Greek cities, wives were confined to their homes, forbidden from participating in public life, social gatherings, or cultural events. They couldn't attend theatre performances, political assemblies, or religious festivals that included men. Their entire world contracted to domestic spaces where they existed solely to produce legitimate heirs and manage household affairs. Even within these restricted spheres, women faced constant humiliation and sexual exploitation. Husbands routinely maintained relationships with male lovers, female slaves, and prostitutes. These affairs weren't conducted secretly or apologetically. They were expected aspects of masculine behavior that wives were required to accept without complaint or protest. The sexual double standard operated with absolute and merciless consistency. A wife's adultery was punishable by death or permanent exile. Her children stripped of inheritance rights and social standing. A husband's infidelity was considered normal male behavior that actually demonstrated his virility and social status. Women who showed jealousy or resentment were labeled as unreasonable troublemakers who threatened social stability. This system trapped women in marriages where they possessed no rights, no voice, and no hope of escape. Divorce was nearly impossible for women to obtain, requiring proof of extreme circumstances that few could document or survive long enough to present. The legal system was designed and operated exclusively by men, ensuring that female complaints about sexual abuse or domestic violence would never receive serious consideration. Religious institutions added another dimension of horror to women's experiences through practices that sanctified sexual exploitation under divine authority. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth maintained over 1,000 sacred prostitutes, donated by families as religious offerings to ensure divine favor and community prosperity. These women weren't volunteers serving a spiritual calling they had chosen freely. They were human sacrifices to economic and religious systems that commodified their bodies for profit while claiming divine sanction for the practice. Families dedicated daughters to temple service, knowing they would spend their entire lives providing sexual services to male worshippers who viewed them as religious commodities rather than human beings. The religious framework provided moral justification for what amounted to organized sexual slavery operated on an industrial scale. Temples generated enormous revenue from these services, funding massive construction projects and supporting elaborate priestly hierarchies that lived in luxury, while the women themselves saw none of this profit. They had become valuable property generating income for institutions that owned them completely. Their bodies transformed into religious commodities in a system that sanctified sexual abuse through divine authority. Archaeological evidence from temple sites reveals the massive scope of these operations. Excavations have uncovered living quarters designed to house hundreds of women, elaborate bathing facilities for preparing them for clients, and administrative buildings for managing what was essentially a religious brothel empire. These weren't small spiritual practices conducted by a few devoted followers. They were major economic enterprises built on systematic sexual exploitation disguised as divine service. The selection process for temple prostitutes followed the same patterns of calculated exploitation found throughout Greek society. Young girls were chosen based on physical beauty and family desperation, with poor families viewing temple service as their daughter's only option for survival. Wealthy families used these donations to discharge religious obligations without sacrificing their own comfort or convenience. The psychological manipulation began early and operated with devastating effectiveness. Girls entered temple service believing they had been chosen by the gods themselves, blessed with divine purpose that elevated them above ordinary mortals. The religious indoctrination was so thorough that many came to view their exploitation as sacred duty, unable to recognize their victimization, even as it systematically destroyed their lives and spirits. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Greek sexual culture was the widespread use of erotic magic designed to control and manipulate unwilling partners. Ancient Greeks practiced love spells and binding rituals with the same casual acceptance they showed for any other form of commerce or social interaction. These weren't harmless romantic gestures or desperate attempts at connection. They were calculated efforts to override human consent through supernatural coercion. The magical practices revealed the true depths of Greek attitudes towards sexual autonomy and personal choice. Men regularly employed professional spellcasters to compel specific women to desire them, viewing magical coercion as perfectly acceptable when physical force might prove inconvenient or socially awkward. The spells themselves involved elaborate rituals that could take weeks to complete, including burning wax effigies, reciting detailed incantations, and burying cursed objects near the intended victim's home or workplace. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered thousands of cursed tablets containing explicit sexual demands written in lead and buried in graveyards or thrown into sacred wells. These weren't abstract wishes for love or affection that modern people might find romantic. They were detailed instructions to supernatural forces, commanding specific sexual acts from named individuals with terrifying precision and graphic detail. The tablets describe binding spells designed to drive women mad with uncontrollable desire, forcing them to abandon their families, their responsibilities, and their sanity to seek out the spellcaster. The language used reveals a predatory mindset that viewed women not as autonomous beings capable of choice, but as targets to be conquered through whatever means proved most effective. Professional practitioners offered specialized services for different types of sexual coercion, operating openly in major cities throughout the Greek world. Some focused on seducing unwilling partners through magical manipulation of their emotions. Others specialized in breaking up existing relationships to create romantic opportunities for paying clients. The most disturbing category involves spells designed to make women sexually insatiable, transforming them into objects of pure lust incapable of rational thought or self-protection. The effectiveness of these practices mattered less than their widespread social acceptance throughout Greek civilization. Society tolerated magical sexual coercion because it reflected broader attitudes about male entitlement and female autonomy. If a woman could be compelled through physical force, economic pressure, or social manipulation, then magical coercion seemed equally legitimate and morally acceptable. Even more horrifying were the documented practices involving animals that appeared throughout Greek literature and historical accounts with disturbing frequency. While often attributed to foreign cultures or mythological contexts, the sheer volume of references suggests these behaviors were familiar concepts in Greek society rather than exotic curiosities from distant lands. Greek literature doesn't condemn such acts as perverse aberrations that violated natural order. Instead, these practices are treated as exotic mysteries or divine interventions that revealed hidden truths about the nature of desire itself. The mythological framework provided convenient justification for behaviors that violated every natural boundary by giving them divine precedent and supernatural sanction. Stories of gods transforming into animals to seduce or rape mortals weren't presented as cautionary tales warning against such behavior. They were celebrated myths, performed in theatres, and depicted in public art throughout the Greek world. Zeus becoming a bull to assault Europa wasn't a story about divine corruption or moral failure. It was entertainment that normalized bestial practices by associating them with the king of the gods himself. The medical and philosophical writings of the period discuss these practices with clinical detachment that proves more disturbing than outright condemnation would have been. Greek physicians wrote detailed accounts of treating injuries resulting from animal contact, approaching the subject with the same professional objectivity they applied to broken bones or fever treatment. Philosophers debated whether such acts violated natural law or represented alternative expressions of human desire that deserved intellectual consideration. The casual academic approach reveals a society where literally nothing was considered too extreme to discuss, practice, or defend through sophisticated reasoning. The concept of consent, already severely limited in Greek society, completely disappeared when applied to slaves and foreign captives. These populations existed entirely outside legal protection, available for any form of sexual exploitation their owners desired without restriction or oversight. The systematic abuse of enslaved people reached levels that made other historical atrocities appear restrained by comparison. Greek households routinely maintained slaves purchased specifically for sexual purposes. These weren't individuals who happened to be attractive and were occasionally exploited. They were human beings bred and trained for their sexual utility, with children born from these arrangements automatically becoming property of the household to continue the cycle of exploitation into the next generation. The legal framework supporting this system operated with comprehensive ruthlessness that eliminated any possibility of resistance or escape. Slaves had no right to refuse sexual demands from their owners or anyone their owners designated as having access to them. Resistance was punished with torture, mutilation, or death, while even testimony about sexual abuse was inadmissible in court because slaves couldn't legally accuse citizens of wrongdoing. The scale of this exploitation becomes apparent when examining household inventories from wealthy Greek families, which categorized hundreds of slaves by their intended use, including explicit sexual purposes. These weren't hidden records kept secret from authorities. They were official documents filed with local governments for taxation and insurance purposes, operating openly because the practices they documented were perfectly legal and socially acceptable. Market records show the prices paid for slaves designated for sexual use, with premium costs for younger individuals, specific physical characteristics, and particular skills. The commercial nature of this trade reveals how completely Greek society had commodified human sexuality, creating markets where people could be bought and sold for the specific purpose of sexual exploitation. Training facilities operated throughout the Greek world, preparing enslaved people for their sexual roles through systematic conditioning that broke down their resistance and natural human responses. These institutions combined physical abuse with psychological manipulation, creating victims who appeared to cooperate with their exploitation while having no genuine choice in the matter. The documentation of these practices survived in administrative records, legal cases, and even philosophical discussions about the proper treatment of human property. The casual way these sources discuss sexual slavery reveals a civilization that had normalized horrors beyond modern comprehension, transforming systematic rape into routine household management. As we delve deeper into the archaeological evidence and literary sources, the full scope of Greek sexual exploitation becomes impossible to ignore or minimize. Every aspect of their society, from the highest philosophical schools to the humblest domestic arrangements, operated through systematic sexual dominance that reduced vast populations to objects existing solely for the pleasure and convenience of those with power. The philosophical justifications they created for these practices reveal the true genius of systematic oppression operating at its most sophisticated level. By transforming child abuse into education, sexual slavery into religion, and magical coercion into romance, they created a cultural framework where victims couldn't resist what society celebrated as beneficial to them. The patterns we've uncovered throughout this investigation reveal a civilization that had answered fundamental moral questions about sexuality by deciding that the powerful possessed unlimited rights over the weak. This wasn't a society struggling with ethical dilemmas about human dignity and consent. This was a culture that had systematically eliminated such concerns through philosophical frameworks that justified exploitation as virtue. The democracy that gave political voice to male citizens operated alongside systems that silenced everyone else through sexual subjugation. The philosophical schools that produced history's most celebrated thinkers simultaneously created intellectual justifications for practices that would horrify any modern civilization. The temples that claimed to connect mortals with divine wisdom sanctified sexual slavery as a religious duty. What makes this legacy particularly disturbing is how successfully the Greeks managed to separate their intellectual achievements from their sexual practices in historical memory. For over 2 millennia, scholars have studied Greek philosophy while ignoring Greek sexual culture, preserving the marble statues and democratic ideals while burying the voices of countless victims. The influence of these practices extended far beyond ancient Greece itself, shaping Roman law, early Christian theology, and Western legal traditions that followed. The same arguments used to defend systematic sexual exploitation appear in modified forms throughout subsequent civilizations, revealing how easily sophisticated societies can normalize horrific behaviors through cultural conditioning and institutional support. The next time you encounter ancient Greece portrayed as humanity's golden age of reason and democracy, remember the children forced into sexual relationships with their teachers, the women treated as breeding property, the enslaved populations existing solely for sexual exploitation, and the magical practices designed to override human consent. Behind every celebrated philosophical dialogue stood a system built on sexual domination, so comprehensive it makes modern atrocities appear limited by comparison. That's the real legacy of classical antiquity that history books conveniently omit.